Opening a diagonal for the queen and bishop immediately sets up central pawn tension and invites a dynamic game. Unleashing the dragon's teeth, black immediately aims to fianchetto the bishop, creating a dynamic kingside defense with a fianchetto setup. Seizing central real estate, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's fianchetto setup, aiming to disrupt its defensive harmony. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal gaze sets the stage for active development and potential pressure along the long diagonal. Securing the center and preparing development, this knight prepares to pressure black's fianchettoed bishop and expand white's influence. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's pawn presence is a sound positional step, opening lines for development. Developing the bishop to e3 solidifies the center and eyes the queenside, preparing for kingside castling without exposing the king. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure, this move prepares for a potential b5 advance, aiming to control the c-file and expand black's influence. Controlling the queenside central squares directly weakens black's pawn chain and opens avenues for attack. Solidifying the queenside flank, b6 aims to prepare a fianchetto counterplay on the queenside or simply support the central pawns, a prudent long-term maneuver. Safeguarding the king's diagonal is the primary concern here, preventing any immediate pin or discovery by black's bishop on g7 along the long diagonal. It also subtly prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, creating a crucial airspace for the monarch to retreat if necessary. Developing the bishop to its fianchettoed square completes the characteristic setup for the king's Indian defense, exerting influence along the long diagonal towards white's queenside while also reinforcing the pawn chain. Developing the knight towards the center now prepares to castle and reinforces control over key central squares, especially d5, which will be crucial as the pawn structure solidifies. Solidifying the center and preparing for piece development, this move opens a diagonal for the queen and aims to establish a more robust pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to the diagonal overlooking black's kingside creates immediate attacking potential, aiming to exploit the now less defended squares around the enemy monarch, while simultaneously preparing to join the central fight and potentially open lines for a more aggressive middle game. Developing the knight to e7 conserves the king's pawn majority on the queenside and prepares for a potential an f6 maneuver, but it also cedes some central mobility and slightly obstructs the bishop on g7's view of the d4 pawn. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield solidifies white's center and prepares for active operations on the kingside, potentially creating a powerful attacking spearhead. The knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential central outposts and preparing to support a kingside pawn advance if the opportunity arises, while also adding defensive coverage to the kingside. Opening the central file for potential rook activity, Ray1 prepares to support a future pawn push in the center or even double rooks if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously defending the e-pawn. Unlocking castling here tidies up black's king's safety, a vital prerequisite for any broader positional ambitions. It also allows the rook on f8 to participate more actively in the central drama now that the king has found sanctuary. Preparing to elevate the queen to a more active square, potentially to c2 or b4, sets the stage for increased pressure along the c-file and the queenside diagonal, aiming to exploit the slight immobility of black's pawns. Challenging white's central pawn structure immediately, black seeks to disrupt the established harmony and open lines for counterplay, a bold assertion of activity in the face of white's solid development. Releasing central pawn tension now, 12. dxc5 opens diagonal lines for your bishop and potentially allows for rapid knight development, aiming to exploit the now unprotected squares. The knight boldly reclaims central territory, initiating a dynamic pawn exchange that opens up the d-file and creates immediate tension around white's queen. This capture, while seemingly aggressive, initiates a series of tactical possibilities and forces white to react precisely to maintain their advantage. It's a calculated risk, potentially leading to a more open and complex middle game where precise calculation will be paramount. The absorption of the pawn also frees up black's bishop on g7, allowing it to exert influence along the long diagonal. Unifying the rooks along the d-file now establishes a formidable pressure point, aiming to exploit the open nature of the position and the potential weakness on d6, while simultaneously preparing to challenge black's own potentially passive pieces. Liberating the knight from its defensive post on d7, this daring pawn grab immediately disrupts white's central control and injects significant tactical fireworks into the position, creating an immediate clash for key squares. Recapturing the pawn instantly reshapes the center, opening lines and creating immediate tension where black's queen may find itself exposed. Reclaiming the knight with the bishop immediately addresses the central pawn tension, allowing black to solidify their structure and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously freeing the d-pawn for future mobility. Instantly seizing the initiative, this recapture on d6 ignites a dynamic struggle for central control and opens up lines of attack that were previously blocked. White, by sacrificing a pawn, has fundamentally altered the board's complexion, transforming a relatively quiet positional game into a sharp tactical skirmish where piece activity and initiative will likely outweigh material for the time being. The queen's bold foray now puts immediate pressure on black's king and potentially exposes weaknesses in their pawn structure, forcing them to react and defend rather than continue their own developing plans. A bold queen sacrifice to simplify and potentially activate the rook on the d-file, aiming to contest open lines. Initiating rook dominance on the d-file now creates immediate pressure against black's pawn structure and could lead to favorable exchanges. Black initiates a bold counterthrust, immediately challenging white's centralized queen and aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces by bringing the knight into an active central square. Seizing the open file offers an immediate tactical advantage, but consider the potential king's safety implications, as black's pieces now have clearer lines of attack towards your monarch after this pawn capture. Liberating the knight from its cramped position allows it to rejoin the fray, aiming to disrupt white's control over the c-file and potentially exploit the newly opened diagonals. Reclaiming the rook solidifies white's material advantage and prepares for a smoother transition into the endgame, forcing black to confront the isolated pawn on d6. Bagging a pawn like that, while tempting, opens up a dangerous situation around your king. Securing the 7th rank with this pawn advance aims to restrict black's rook and potentially create mating nets on the queen side, while also eyeing the c6 square for future incursions. Opening the b-file is a decisive step, aiming to pierce white's pawn structure and create immediate pressure on the back rank, a promising strategy given the somewhat exposed king position. Unleashing the knight to a centralized outpost, this maneuver creates immediate tension and aims to exploit black's slightly awkward piece placement on the queen side. White is looking to disrupt the coordination of black's pieces and potentially open lines towards the vulnerable king. Observe how this centralized knight can become a powerful attacker or a solid defender, dictating play for the coming turns. The sacrifice of the rook opens up a fascinating tactical web, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and promising an aggressive counterplay for black. White's pieces are now somewhat awkwardly placed after the series of exchanges, and black can look to exploit the newly created open files and potential weaknesses around the king. This is no longer a quiet positional struggle. It's a sharp calculation contest where piece activity and initiative will be paramount for both sides. Seizing the open, a file now offers a significant spatial advantage, pressuring black's queenside pawns and restricting their piece mobility. A desperate attempt to regain material balance by black, aiming to eliminate a key attacking piece and open lines, but it might prematurely expose the king to a now dominant queen and rook battery. Seizing control of the open file and preparing to penetrate black's position with the rook, this maneuver aims to exploit the weakness on the c2 square now that the bishop is no longer there to defend it. White's intention is to create a passed pawn or disrupt black's pawn structure by forcing exchanges. The rook now repositions, aiming to challenge the open b-file and potentially support the isolated pawn on a5. A subtle yet crucial maneuver to prevent white from fully exploiting the queenside advantage. Restoring the rook to its rightful diagonal allows for greater mobility and prepares for potential future advances on the queen side, while simultaneously offering improved defense for the king. The bishop now aims to activate itself across the queen side, seeking influence on the now open 7th rank and potentially setting up tactical skirmishes or regrouping for defensive duties on the king side. Seizing the initiative, this piece sacrifice aims to disrupt Black's coordination and exploit the exposed dark squares around their king. By clearing a path for the rook, White is setting up a potential raid on the queen side. That pawn push was a tactical blunder, sacrificing a central pawn for very little in return. However, Black's counterattack on the queenside pawns is a strong positional response, aiming to regain lost material and simplify the position. Focusing on the central pawn structure, White aims to solidify their advantage by anchoring the bishop on this active square, creating a formidable defensive bastion that also eyes potential threats on the king side. A bold re-engagement, aiming to disrupt White's newly established pawn structure and potentially activate the rook from the queen side. This maneuver attempts to exploit the slight overextension of White's pawns by creating immediate threats along the 4th rank, forcing White to react defensively rather than continuing their planned central advancement. It's a calculated gamble to inject some dynamic imbalance back into a position that was solidifying for White. Boldly reasserting central influence, White aims to neutralize the active bishop that had been a thorn in their side. By placing the bishop on d3, the intention is to make that diagonal less comfortable for Black's pieces, while simultaneously preparing to potentially redeploy the bishop to a more defensive or attacking square as the game unfolds. This maneuver is also about positional prophylaxis, anticipating potential threats and limiting Black's counterplay in the center. The king embarks on a vital repositioning maneuver, seeking the relative safety of the kingside corner, a prudent step in anticipation of potential exchanges that might expose its current central location. Fortifying the king's safe haven becomes paramount now, aiming to prevent any immediate tactical incursions on the central squares. Unleashing the pawn storm begins, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and gain queenside space, potentially creating weaknesses for the white king. A deliberate repositioning, focusing on king safety and centralizing the monarch amidst the emerging open files, preparing for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers as the endgame beckons. Initiating pawn advances on the kingside often signals an intent to create attacking chances, and here, the intention is to push this pawn chain forward, potentially opening lines or creating space for future maneuvers. Shifting the rook to the 2nd rank aims to potentially double rooks on the d-file, a powerful strategy for controlling central open lines and pressuring Black's position. Building that pawn chain looks like a plan to solidify your kingside defense and potentially restrict White's rook activity down the d-file. The monarch embarks on a central journey, seeking to activate its dormant power and perhaps shore up the pawn structure's integrity before the endgame truly solidifies. Unleashing the pawn can invigorate the kingside, aiming to crack open lines for the bishop or even the rook on the f-file, but it also opens up potential weaknesses down the diagonal if White can exploit the weakened dark squares. Consolidating the bishop's post to the central e2 square fortifies the pawn chain and prepares a potential kingside pawn storm, subtly reorienting the focus from the now closed queenside. Placing the king on the 6th rank initiates a perilous journey, exposing it to potential attacks and neglecting essential defensive duties. Black should prioritize solidifying their pawn structure and preparing for the inevitable endgame complexities. Repositioning the king to f2 aims to consolidate the monarch's safety, creating a more stable defensive structure as the middle game transitions towards a more active phase, potentially preparing for pawn advancements or future peace maneuvers. Shifting the king to the center now, seeking an active role in the unfolding proceedings, is a bold choice that significantly impacts the pawn structure's future stability. Focusing the monarch towards the center offers the king increased mobility and a more central role in the unfolding endgame dynamics. The monarch makes a dashing sortie, seeking open avenues for activity and forcing White's hand with this timely check. The king steps back, a temporary retreat as the central pawn structure is beginning to fray, and the lurking threat of the black rook on the third rank cannot be ignored. Rerouting the bishop to the queenside flank opens up intriguing possibilities, aiming to exploit the newly established outpost on b5 and potentially create counterplay against white's pawn structure, while simultaneously defending against any immediate king threats. Navigating the cramped diagonal created by the rook's presence on d1, the bishop retreats to a more flexible square, aiming to support the kingside pawn push that's desperately needed to generate counterplay. A strategic repositioning begins as the rook ventures to the open fourth rank, eyeing potential infiltration or offering support on that crucial horizontal. A crucial moment arrives as white attempts to dislodge the black king from its surprisingly active central post, initiating a delicate repositioning maneuver. The monarch bravely marches forward, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and disrupt white's pawn structure before the opposing pieces can coordinate a unified defense. Seizing control of the file with the bishop's capture opens a clear path for your remaining pawns to advance and potentially create past threats. The rook abandons its outpost, trading itself for a pawn, and in doing so surrenders the last vestige of active piece play on the queenside. The king's march begins, seeking safety and coordination, but watch for any tactical disruptions that could exploit its exposed position. Probing the kingside pawn structure, this move initiates a central pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's neatly coordinated pieces and potentially create a passed pawn down the e-file while opening lines for black's king. Focusing the king's safety towards the queenside, away from the pawn storm brewing on the kingside, offers a more secure haven. Unleashing the pawns opens a dynamic struggle for the central space, injecting immediate tension into the otherwise static position. Unlocking the e-file immediately creates new avenues for your king's safety, a crucial consideration as the pawn structure simplifies. Opening that kingside pawn shield, e4, is a double-edged sword, inviting aggressive counterplay, but also offering a crucial path to liberation for your monarch as the board empties. Shifting the king to safety is paramount with so many pawns on the board, aiming to prevent it from becoming a target in the later stages of this complex pawn structure. Activating the rook along the open file and preparing to advance the pawns creates dynamic counterplay for black, seeking to disrupt white's established structure and exploit any potential weaknesses around the king. Securing the rooks along the open file offers a critical defensive posture, potentially preparing for a later rook lift or simply preventing further incursions by black's active pieces. The rook retreats, abandoning the exposed central file, seeking to redeploy and perhaps support a pawn push on the queenside where white's king feels a little restless. Relocating the monarch to the third rank creates a more secure central refuge, offering better protection against further pawn incursions and preparing for potential defensive maneuvers should the opponent's king advance aggressively. The king, exposed and vulnerable, ventures into the heart of the enemy's reduced pawn structure, aiming for a potential comeback by leveraging the open files. The monarch's desperate trek to safety continues, seeking sanctuary on the edge of the board. That check forces the white king to an exposed square, potentially setting up more forcing continuations as the pawn structure on the kingside is quite open. Forcing the king into a perpetual check, a desperate maneuver to avoid an even worse outcome. A desperate attempt to create counterplay by infiltrating the queenside, this rook maneuver boldly seeks to disrupt white's coordinated forces and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king, though it may prove to be a dangerous gamble given the current pawn structure. Unlocking a critical file for rook penetration is paramount as the game simplifies. The pawn pushes forward, seeking to disrupt the white pieces and create new avenues for attack, but it might also be exposing itself to potential tactical exchanges that could simplify the position favorably for white. Asserting control over the open c-file offers a chance to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially force concessions, but be mindful of the active black rook on d3. The black king boldly ventures out, embracing the center and presenting a dynamic threat to white's central pawns, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Opening the diagonal for the king and forcing a response from the black monarch is a decisive maneuver in this endgame. The black king is venturing out, seeking active participation in the pawn storm, but exposing itself to potential dangers along the light squares where white's remaining pieces have good influence. A pragmatic repositioning aims to challenge the intrusive rook and potentially exploit any defensive weaknesses around black's advanced pawns. Rook activation finally begins, pushing the attack along the second rank and forcing white's king into a more exposed position. Suddenly, a brilliant check forces the black king to scatter, exposing its weaknesses. The king boldly ventures out, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay in this tense endgame. The white monarch abandons the relative safety of the kingside to consolidate its position and prepare for the final phase of the game. The king's exposed position on the edge of the board invites relentless harassment, and this rook sacrifice aims to create a decisive passed pawn on the file. Securing the 8th rank now prevents any sneaky pawn invasions from the black king, a crucial defensive consolidation. The rook's advance to the 1st rank aims to disrupt white's monarch, but it walks into a forced sequence that leaves black's king exposed on the edge of the board. Focusing on king safety, abandoning it to the g-file now invites immediate mating threats. The king is forced into a perilous alley, a tight spot from which escape seems unlikely, while the rook's maneuver creates an immediate threat that demands precise calculation to avoid a devastating checkmate. The king seeks refuge from the checks, prioritizing safety over any active pursuit. The persistent repetition of the rook's position on the b-file suggests black is strategically repositioning, perhaps seeking a more active outpost or preparing to defend against an impending pawn push on the kingside. The king's precarious position, exposed on the open g-file, invites a desperate check, forcing a concession of tempo and further retreat. The black king boldly ventures out, seeking to disrupt white's endgame superiority through active play. Dominating the open file with the rook is paramount, seizing the initiative and preparing for a decisive offensive thrust.